So that was great.
Okay, I'm back, and I started up the recording. And let's see, gallery view lets me see all the little rectangles.
Yeah, I think we have quite a lot fewer on this session, but yeah.
Okay, well, Zoom attrition, it's a real thing. All right. Oh, well. Okay. All right, and here comes sun and moon. Welcome back. All right. So, any threads that anybody wants to pick up on that are hanging from anything we've done so far? Really interested in the interaction if there's any to be had. Otherwise, we can just keep forging ahead. Jennifer, I see you. Go for it.
So I was trying, Lydia, the sort of retraction of the upper chest there, the upper thoracic, and I didn't know if you could offer any more points because I was having difficulty doing it without getting my shoulders involved, as we discussed. Any other hints there about what I should be targeting? I wasn't terribly successful in my own.
Well, as I mentioned, I actually thought you were doing a really good job, particularly when I saw you going into the warrior. What I would encourage you to do is do less work and let it be. Just imagine what little bits of tissue can let go back here. Don't think about the front so much. Just think about what can let go back here, because when that stuff starts releasing, this starts settling. And what I like thinking is that it is settling. It's not moving. I'm not drawing it back. It's just settling in. But you have to find a way to release for it to settle back. So it's frustrating at the start. I mean, it was literally years of my working with a gyrotonic teacher and with Leslie and getting body work and acupuncture and all kinds of stuff. But when I finally started a way to let go of that stuff in the back of my body, first off, I was disappointed. Leslie, you were talking about you felt taller. Well, I got shorter when I stopped. When I found a way to release the stuff in the back of my body. I had been doing that Pilates like vertical thing for so many years, and I felt wonderfully tall and relatively slimmer. And all of a sudden, when I let go of this stuff, I got down to what I guess is my real height. Oh, well.
I have a couple bone spurs on the front of C6 and C7, so I try not to do this much stuff anymore. And so that's why I was asking if there are any hints you can give me so that I can.
Oh, I can tell what you just did.
Experience. What?
If I were in the room with you and I'd seen you do what you just did, I would have come right over to you. Because what you just did was you pushed your jaw forward and then you went down, which put a lot more pressure in the front. I would have drawn you back here and said, just feel this. I'm not moving my chin down very much. The ultimate amount of space of release that I can get, I don't get very close here. I mean, other people might, but I sure don't. I'm releasing up and over, you know?
I'll work on it. Thank you.
Sure. Now, and keep in mind, people spend years and years studying things like Alexander technique or Feldenkrais to unravel some of the very deeply rooted patterning we have in this area. And it is the deepest rooted postural patterning that we have as humans. Our postural development proceeds from our mouth downward towards our feet in our first year of life, towards the end of which we eventually start standing and actually becoming bipeds. But the very first sort of postural skills, if you want to describe it that way. The very first part of our body that we learn to really support in gravity is this noggin of ours. And with babies, it comprises a significantly higher percentage of their overall body weight than it does for adults, right? It's babies have big heads. And so, you know, and we know that they really, most babies, not all, most babies are not born with the ability to support their head. The reason I say not all is because Lydia happens to be one of those babies who came out like, boom, like right away, out of the chute. She was like looking to see what's going on. But that's rare. And so the combination of sucking and breathing and swallowing that a newborn infant has to coordinate from the very first moments of extrauterine life in order to survive, all go into the toning and the coordination of the muscles of the jaw, the tongue, the throat, the neck muscles. All of them come together to eventually create the tone and coordination that's required to support the weight of the head. So we do not have older postural skills in our system than the ones that govern how we get this thing supported in space on tops of our spines. And so it is a project. It is definitely a project. And there's strategies, there's techniques, there's entire systems. You know, the Alexander system is primarily about that, about the positioning of the head, neck, jaw, skull on the upper spine, and that was that's something that was developed by F.M. Alexander out of necessity, because he was an orator. You know, he made a living delivering speeches, and he lost his voice, and no one could help him. No one could figure out what was wrong. And what it turns out Alexander needed to do was study the Alexander method, only he had to invent it first. And so what he did was he got this array of mirrors that was able to reflect him from angles he could not ordinarily see. He could see to the side and to the back of him. And he began to notice as he was speaking these patterns that he was like drawing his head and neck into this position that was shutting off his vocal cords. And he eventually learned how to undo that, and he got his voice back, and then he started teaching it. And that's how the Alexander method got started. But it took a lot of very detailed self-observation for him to do that, and for us to do it for ourselves. See, we're just pointing out the fact that, hey, you got lung here, you got joints here, these can articulate, these can move. Can they? Or are they frozen? And one of the reasons I like to use the breath as one of the ways to work on this is it's sometimes that's what just makes it click for someone. It's like, oh, what's it like to breathe into the backs of my lungs, to the backs of the tops of my lungs? What is it like to do a movement like this, feeling that it's arising from the breath in the lungs in my armpits? You know, these are very potent images, which happen to correspond with anatomical reality. And sometimes they can shift our focus just enough to break us of even a very deeply ingrained pattern. So yeah, it's a project.
I'm not sure sorry, did you see what Tanya wrote? That she found the arms to the sides helped to exclude the shoulders leading forward and up. My response to that, I just want to give that quickly before I mute, is that when Leslie first taught me these movements, it took a little bit of effort for me to learn to initiate them from here rather than initiate them from my hands. And that makes the difference. If I can initiate from here, I get an opening. If I initiate from the hands, it doesn't do anything to change the way my shoulders work. So that's just my experience.
Yeah. And the beauty of this being a breath-centered practice is, apart from anything else you're intending to do or trying to do, if you just hold your arms out here and breathe. And remember that there's stuff up here that breathes. Breath is shape change.
Jennifer,
breath.
could I encourage you maybe to move your hands into your front body a little bit? I don't know if you're a particularly bendy person, but I sometimes see in people who are very mobile in their shoulders that they tend to go way back. And yeah, right. So if you bring them into where you actually can see them with your peripheral vision, you may find that you have a different kind of release in your shoulder girdle.
Mhm. Yeah, what I was trying to say there is that remembering that breath is shape change. That's what it is. There's no ability to get air in and out of our body unless the cavity in which the lungs live can change its shape and volume. That's what breathing is. And all the muscles that coordinate and sometimes discoordinate to get that to happen are muscles that can affect our ability to increase or decrease the volume of the thoracic cavity. Because it's only through changing the shape and the volume that the pressure differentials that get the air to push its way in and push its way back out can occur. So there's no, breath is shape change. They're synonymous. And so if I'm looking for a subtle shape change, I'm looking for subtle breath. And whether my arms are here or here or here or to the side or, you know, in any position, the fact is I'm going to have to be breathing as I'm doing this exploration. And by starting with that, sometimes we can find a pathway to unravel some of these, even as I said, deeply held patterns. So cool. Anything else before we move on? Because I have some fun video to share with you. Because the topic, the official topic for this afternoon, well, it's all been afternoon. We started at 12:30 for the latter part of the workshop right now, is better back bends through breathing. So it would be helpful, in my view, to understand some of the movements of some of the shape changing movements of breathing that are related to the spine. So what I'm doing is I'm just getting the video queued up here, okay, so that I can screen share it. And here we go. All right, so, and I'm going to be, there we are. Okay, right, so can everyone see this screen here? It's a video, it says Art of Breathing. Yes, thumbs up if you're seeing the video, just double checking, good. So the sound is not necessary because I'll be narrating. And just so you know, there is a link to this video on that webpage we created for you. And this was created, this animation was created by someone I know, Jessica Wolf. She is an Alexander teacher, a voice teacher, and a breathing specialist. And she worked for many years with someone here in New York named Carl Stow, who was very well known for his work with singers and other people with breathing difficulties. They used to call him Dr. Breath. He wasn't a doctor, he was a choral director who stumbled into some of these methods of working with the breath. And he was very influential in the field of breath work. And I'm very glad Jessica did this video because I always wanted to have a video that showed some of these things. And I know how difficult they are to produce. And I thought I would have to be the one doing it. But when this came out, I was very pleased that I didn't have to do it. So here we go. So I'm just going to hit play here. And I'm going to point a few things out as this goes into motion. Okay. And I'm going to actually loop the screen, loop the video so it'll keep going. So we can see the front view, the movement of the rib cage. It gets wider from side to side. That's the most obvious thing from the front view. From the side view, we can see that also the rib cage on an inhale gets deeper from front to back. right? We can see that these are the movements of shape volume change that produce the pressure differentials that get the air in and out of the body. So it's just looped around again. And if you like, you can even breathe along with it. It's kind of a fun thing to do. It's kind of a nice rhythm. And you notice the shoulder girdle, the collarbones, the scapula, they're in motion, right? Why? Because what they're sitting on is in motion. It's not like the shoulder muscles are being used to make the rib cage move. There's no muscles being depicted here, but the idea that the shoulders shouldn't move at all as we're breathing is not correct. The question is, are we trying to use the shoulders to impose these movements on the rib cage, which is not a particularly functional way for most people to breathe? Or are they relaxed enough so they can be carried along with this breath movement, in which case they will be moving. But just to say they shouldn't move is not a very useful thing to tell someone. And that usually goes along with saying we shouldn't be breathing in the tops of our rib cage either. So what I'm going to pause this right now, okay, so that I can manipulate the, yeah, okay. So I'm just going to go back to where this, okay. So here's, and this relates to the topic at hand, better back bends through breathing. So I just pointed out how from this view, it's very clear to see how the rib cage gets deeper from front to back as we inhale, and then it gets narrower as we exhale, right? And that's not just happening in the front of the rib cage. Notice what's happening at the back of the rib cage. That's part of this widening movement. Notice, in other words, what's happening to that curve of the thoracic spine during breath movement. And I'll run it slowly so you can see. So here's an exhale. Do you see what happened to the curve of the thoracic spine? Here's an inhale. What happened to the curve? Here's an exhale. Inhale, exhale. Is it pretty clear? So if you had to describe that movement you're observing in the thoracic spine using the language we've been immersed in, meaning flexion extension, okay, what would you call this? And what would you call that? That looks like flexion to me. We all agree? Flexion is when you increase the thoracic curve of the spine. It's what happens in the cat position on your hands and knees, right? And extension, or at least coming out of flexion, is a movement towards extension. Flexion, extension. Inhale, exhale. Inhale, exhale. Isn't that interesting? Considering the breath cueing that we use in yoga, that I've been using in some of these exercises for flexion extension. Aren't we always cueing back bends on an inhale and forward bends on an exhale? But this is kind of showing the opposite, isn't it? Here's an inhale. I mean, that looks, to me, that looks like a forward bend in my thoracic spine, not a backward bend. Here's an exhale, and that looks more like it's moving in the direction of a backward bend. What do you make of that? I'm just curious. What are your thoughts? Is it confusing, or does it make sense based on stuff that you've sensed in your body or tried or experimented with or practiced with in your yoga? I'm just, because when I first learned that, when I first sort of had that pointed out to me, it was bad news. It was bad news because of stuff I had been saying my whole yoga teaching life, not only about when to inhale and when to exhale, but the anatomical explanations I had come up with for why extension is an inhale and flexion is an exhale. See, I had gone the extra leap of that explanation, and that showed up as like terribly bad news for the anatomical wisdom I thought I was imparting. In fact, if you read the current edition of Yoga Anatomy, in the breathing chapter, which has been rewritten, okay, but the current edition has that language in it where I'm equating extension of the spine with an inhale and flexion of the spine with an exhale. When, if this video is even close to being correct, and by the way, it is, it seems like something exactly the opposite is part of this breath motion of the rib cage. Any thoughts? Are we okay? Is there cognitive dissonance? Is there, yeah, Amanda, you're shaking your head.
Well, Leslie, a few people have typed messing with my mind. And then Amanda says ditto. It's also how
Ditto.
breathing is viewed in a lot of exercise classes.
Of course it is. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it is. Totally. Right. Well, if we go back to the video, we can see why. Again, what is it? I've already identified it. It's a frontist prejudice. Okay. Stop looking at the spine. If it upsets you, stop looking at the spine. Look at the front. Look at the front. See? Inhale. Yeah. Exhale. No. From the front of the body, yeah, it looks like a back bend. From the front of the body, the exhale looks like a forward bend, right? It lifts up, it drops down. Lifting up, back bend, inhale. Dropping down, forward bend, exhale. Okay. As long as you confine your attention to the front of the body, this won't be confusing. But we are three-dimensional beings. We do have backs as well as fronts. Newton's third law is in effect in the universe we inhabit. So whenever something is moving in one direction, there is something that is always moving the other way on the other side of that movement, that energy equation. And so that's just the way things are. We have been the victims of a frontist prejudice. We're just the world, the yoga world is inhabited by a bunch of frontists. And it cuts across culture and it cuts across education. It's just, we pay attention to these dynamics because they're more obvious and we identify more easily with the fronts of our bodies. But I will submit that some of the dynamics that may be making backbending poses more difficult for people have to do with this cueing, right? If you permit yourself to enter into a backbend, spinal extension on an exhale, see how the breath motion is actually helping the spine, whereas the inhale is trying to pull it the other way. And see, now stop looking at the thoracic spine, look at the lumbar and the pelvis. Can you see she's added those motions to the breath? The whole spine is doing something here. It's not just the thoracic. Can you see? So actually, you can make a case for the inhale being part of a backbend if you're looking at the dynamics of the pelvis and the lumbar spine, okay? But the 12 vertebrae of the thoracic spine, which are quite limited in their ability to backbend just structurally, those, if we're going to bring those into it, we need to at least entertain the possibility that an exhale could get the thoracic spine a little more participating in a backward bend motion. How much backward bend does the thoracic spine have, right? That is an interesting question. And we have some good, strong evidence along those lines, right? Of how capable various parts of the spine are in these movements. I'm queuing up just another slide here to share with you because this is an interesting question that has been answered with a certain amount of accuracy. Where is it? I thought I had that right where I wanted it. And my slideshow once again is betraying me. Okay. Yeah. Okay. I know where it is in this other one. I always keep a backup because things get lost and you never know if you'll be able to find them in the moment when you need them. Okay. So for starters here, let's just look at this. I'm going to share this screen now that I found it. Okay. I showed this yesterday. And here we go. So this is a pose that Krishnamacharya cataloged. That extreme back bend. Now this is more of a contortion trick than a useful asana, I feel, for the vast majority of people. And if you look at where that range of motion is actually coming from, all right, there's a bunch of it coming from the hip joints, for one thing. The ability of the pelvis to move into that position, which is extension of the fronts of the hip joints, okay, is part of this motion. And he's getting as much as he can out of his lumbar spine. And then if you notice, if you look to where, I'm going to put my arrow, if you look to where it seems like the lumbar and the thoracic come together, there's like a deep crease there. And you'll see this in contortionists as well. There's like a hinging ability we have in what we call the thoracolumbar junction, where the top of your lumbar spine joins the bottom of your thoracic spine. The area of T11, T12, and L1 right there is very mobile in a bunch of different directions, including twisting. Okay, so, but again, this is a contortion move. Now, what about people who can actually do these sorts of things? So you're seeing the contortionist here on the screen. Sitting on your own head is a kind of a big deal in the contortion community. It kind of gets you into the club to a certain extent. And it's not, it's not that unusual thing to be able to do for a contortionist. Now, it would be nice to see this from the inside. And of course we can, because someone decided to do the MRI. And just like we saw with the standing Uttanasana, right? The Triyangamukha Uttanasana, the backward facing Uttanasana in Krishnamacharya's book, we can see that, yeah, you're getting as much as you can out of a lumbar spine here, because see, these vertebrae are the spinous processes of the lumbar, they're actually touching. Once they touch, that you can't go any further. That's stopping the range of motion. But here, you see, that's the thoracolumbar junction. That you can get a lot of hinging, and you can, in the photograph, you can actually see that deep crease where that hinging is happening, right? Yeah. But look at the thoracic spine. Even a contortionist can't really bend their thoracic spine backward, and that's as it should be. You don't want to get a back bend there, or a lot of back bend there. The spine is constructed to protect your organs, to protect your heart. And this leads to kind of an interesting thing that we like to say a lot in yoga about opening our hearts, right? The way we talk about heart opening is very frontist, frankly, because we think of backbends as the heart opening poses. But opening your heart in that direction is something your thoracic spine is engineered to specifically prevent. And because look at this contortionist. Wouldn't she be a far better performer if this part of her spine could bend back as much as her neck could? Look at her neck. Look how much she's getting out of her neck. Look how much she's getting out of her lumbar. What if this could be bending that far? Wouldn't that be great? No, it wouldn't, because she'd rip her heart to shreds. So your spine actually doesn't want your heart to open too far in a back bend. What it does permit is a lot more motion in flexion. The back of the heart, in other words, is very available for opening in spinal flexion. And the back of the heart, needless to say, if we look at it here, okay, That's where all the vessels come in and out. That's where the heart is fed and feeds the rest of the body. That's where the plumbing comes in the back. So if you're only ever trying to open your heart by back bending, you're actually pinching this stuff closed. So let's give a little love to the heart in flexion, in like, pose of the child is a heart opener for the back, if you're not just a frontist. So I just thought I'd point that out, because these are just anatomical perspectives that I think can have a deep influence on the way we talk about certain things, in particular back bending. I'm not against, if someone presents like, they're all hunched over and collapsed and emotionally shut off and posturally sort of collapsed in this position, it is a wonderful thing to be able to feel your body, feel your breath opening, to feel the front of your body opening again, and have that space there and experience it as kind of a heart opening. Yes, I don't mean to piss on that idea, but 60% of your lungs, the back of your heart, where all the vessels come in and out, that's another perspective to have. And what if we were just permitting this to be heart opening, draping over something and nourishing the back of the lungs, the back of the heart. So anyway, any thoughts or questions about that? Did I see, Christy, did you wave your hand there? Was that, no? Okay, sorry. You were given one of those. All right. Anything? Are these uh-ohs or ahas or both? I warned you about the uh-ohs, but they're all in service of the ahas, right? So anything at all? No? Okay, so practice. How do we, there's a new message. Oh, ahas, Jennifer, ahas. Okay. And Chrissy was saying that the photo of the kid doing the back bend didn't look healthy. His feet are externally rotated. Well, yeah, I mean, he was doing the trick. He grabbed his ankles from behind. That was the thing that you wouldn't look at that and say, oh, what's that?
In and of itself, having your feet externally rotated, if he had a clear pathway of weight, wouldn't be unhealthy, right?
Yeah, I mean, what I was saying is to the eye of what we recognize as good alignment in that pose, we can say, oh, it doesn't look healthy, but there's actually no way to know. And Jennifer is saying, I bet he couldn't do it when he was 50. Yeah, well, and that was the question. That was really the question I had when Lydia and I showed up in Las Vegas 9 years ago to the International Contortion Convention to teach some workshops. And like, where are all the old contortionists, and how do their bodies look after enough years of doing this kind of stuff? And so that was a real question. Well, if you'll permit me for a moment here to share the screen. Okay, so here's the amazing Christina. Got to meet her and hang out and have a lovely chat with her when we were in Australia. She lives near Adelaide. And here she is. Okay. She's in this video from 9 years ago, she was 67 years old, right? And she's doing her thing. When they turn the head like that, it means you should applaud, by the way. That's the sort of universal signal in contortion world. That's like, look at me, clap, right? And there she goes. It's not bad for a 67-year-old, right? Yeah. And actually, she's gonna do that same pose that we saw in Krishnamacharya's book there. She's in the Tiryangamukha Uttanasana. Now, here's the thing about Christina. When she was younger, this pose, she did this same trick and it looked very different. Look how much she has to get from her hip joints. Can you see that? You see how far forward of her base of support she has to send her pelvis, because her head is so far away from her legs. When she was younger, okay, whoops, I'm just going to another screen. When she was younger, okay, she was able to do that pose very differently, because she had more range of motion in her spine, okay? And I don't see that slide right now, but she there is showing you that she had to compensate for her spine getting stiffer by getting much more of this backward movement out of her hip joints. And eventually it was a hip injury that took her out of performing for quite a while. She had to have a hip replacement surgery, and she was still recovering from that when we saw her earlier this year, but getting back to performing, still doing things that very few 72-year-olds should be expected to do. But she's a lifelong performer, and she sees it as a spiritual pursuit. Actually, it's a very interesting lady. Yeah, and the thing about Christina is, she doesn't just do the back bendy tricks; she does the forward bendy tricks. See, here she is doing something that we would call, well, let's go back a bit. Something we would call Upavishta Paschimottanasana, right? It's not plow pose. It's more like Paschimottanasana turned upside down. And she's balancing that glass of water on her forehead and putting her whole body through this hoop, there you go, without spilling the water, right? She's been doing this trick her whole life too. So she trains in forward bending tricks as well as backward bending tricks, which not all contortionists apparently do. Some of them have this weird idea that if you do, there she is. Yeah, that's a big round of applause. Anyway, some contortionists have this very strange idea that if you train in flexion and forward bending, it'll ruin your back bends. When in fact the opposite is true. If you just only ever go in one direction, you're going to ruin your body pretty thoroughly. There were performers far younger. There was an 18-year-old who couldn't perform at the event because she was so injured from like bad training. And there you see Christina still plugging along in her 60s and 70s. So anyway,
Leslie, I also wanted to mention that she does not believe that her need for a hip replacement was due to her performing. She said all of the women in her family had had hip replacements at that point in their lives. So it was a genetic.
She has a family history. She has a family history of degenerative osteoarthritis. And she does, thank you for reminding me of that, because that's something we learned from hanging out with her. She basically came by, honestly, it's a genetic thing that is more prevalent in her family. And she doesn't believe that, as Lydia said, it was her performing that caused that to happen to her hip. So there, right? So I see a couple of comments that have come in here. So perhaps off topic, I'm wondering whether this same aha is also relevant to twists. I'm used to cues to lengthen up on the inhale, but the spine seems more lengthened on the exhale. Absolutely. The question is, are we willing to try it both ways and see what works for us, rather than trying to figure out what's the right or ultimate way to breathe in this particular movement, right? And then Jennifer said, impressive, but what could she do when she was 12? Old comment, you already answered. Okay, yeah. She was doing this at a young age. In fact, Christina posed for a book of photographs, of photographic studies that they were doing at the time of hypermobility. And I wish I could find that series of photos that she posted of herself doing that same back bend at various stages of her life. I thought I had it in this particular slideshow, but apparently not. So yeah, this is something that she was always able to do. I don't think she has a connective tissue disease like Marfan's or Ehlers-Danlos, which is unhealthy range of motion due to a breakdown in the collagenous structure of the body's connective tissues, which affects not just ligaments that hold your joints together, but it affects the connective tissue in your organs. People have heart problems who have these diseases, which are genetic. And the main ones that we find are Ehlers-Danlos and Marfan syndrome, which are somewhat related. The body morphology of people with Ehlers-Danlos and Marfan's is a little different. Marfan's, they're very tall, lanky, kind of a bony structure. It was thought that Abraham Lincoln had Marfan's, actually. He was kind of like posthumously diagnosed with this when they started looking at photos and becoming familiar with some of the problems that he had with his health, right? Not the least of which was a 22 slug to the back of his skull, but you know, he had other health problems. All right, so anyway, I want to show you on the mat how to put some of these ideas into practice, okay? And I'll start with something we did yesterday, okay? Let's make sure I'm visible here. Yep, okay. So when we started on this idea of articulating the spine yesterday, toward the end of the day, I had you doing this movement here. This we call it Dvipada Pitham. Some people just call it bridge. So whatever you call it, basically, you're using the action of the legs, gluteal muscles, to press your feet down into the floor, which causes your pelvis to rise up in the other direction, right? And to do this with a sense of articulating through the spine. So, you know, I can do it, I can think of my entire spine raising up and lowering down as a unit, right? And I'm kind of doing it that way here, right? So I'm basically just moving my spine through space, but I'm not moving any space through my spine, right? So the idea of articulating would be to figure out how to get the movement to start, let's say, by rocking back from the bottom towards the top of my sacrum, and then from the top of my sacrum to the bottom of my lumbars, and then from the top of my lumbars to the bottom of my thoracic, and to come up to, you know, it's about my mid-thoracic. So I'm coming up to about the middle of my thoracic spine here, which is pretty much where the heart is, okay? So I'm up about on, I'd say T6 roughly, which is the more or less the center of my thoracic spine because it has 12 vertebrae. And then on the way down, it's that reverse idea of articulating through the spine. And when I get to the lumbar, it's a little tricky because the arch, this secondary arch of the lumbar, which is what we call a lordotic curve, really does tend to resist coming out of that curve on the way down. So I have to kind of pay attention to that articulation. So I did cue this in a very specific way yesterday. I cued the lift on an exhale and coming down on an inhale, just to get started with it. But my question to you, the basis for an inquiry here would be, what pattern of breath or breaths, in other words, permitting ourselves maybe to need more than one breath to get all the way through the spine. If we go slowly enough, we may have to take extra breaths. What use of the breath or breaths for you most facilitates your ability to articulate on the way up and on the way down? Okay, so that's a question well, I'll invite you to explore, if you like, on your mat. And I'll go to the gallery view here just so we can see what's going on. And I don't know if all of you will be fully visible once you're lying down. Some of your mat positioning work better for the standing stuff. So it's okay. I mean, you know, we don't need to rearrange you at all. I'm just noticing that. Mainly it's what you're noticing, not so much what I'm noticing or what Lydia's noticing at this point. Because if we remember our definition of breathing as shape change, right? Shape change in the cavities, both the abdominal and thoracic cavity. And we remember that the spine is the back of the cavities, then there might be something to learn about how well we can change the shape of our spine by looking at the breath patterning that we can use in this exploration. See, sometimes when we're really getting into the details of spinal mobility and articulation, a single breath, whether it's an inhale or an exhale, on a single movement is a bit of a blunt tool, you know? If we're not permitting ourselves to take multiple cycles of breath in some of these processes, we're limiting the length of time we have to explore them to how long it takes to either inhale or exhale. And sometimes it takes longer than that. Sometimes we need to go a little more slowly. So taking your time with this, you know, maybe do a couple more lifts and lowers, ups and downs. And then I have some other questions we might explore. But first, I'm curious what, if anything, you noticed that was, well, noticeable or useful. Feel free to share or type or not, but just something to notice for yourself. For me personally, I'll share something. When I'm doing that, the very first movement of lifting, as I said, it's kind of rocking my weight from the tail end of my sacrum to the top of the sacrum, to the lumbosacral junction, where, you know, L5 and S1 are. I find, generally speaking, that a little bit of an exhale helps with that. Or conversely, that if I'm able to really articulate that movement, it seems to want to create an exhale, right? To get it started. And I know that that's not true for everyone, because it all depends how I exhale and how I articulate, right? So did anyone notice anything like that they'd care to share? Just giving you a chance here to do that. Yeah, Leslie, go for it. Okay, you have to unmute. Yeah, there you are. Great.
It says I'm muted. I got it. So thinking about breathing, it was the first thing I did was exhale and lift my sacrum. Then I sort of paused, and it actually felt better exhaling up and just sort of pausing as I hit a spot, take a breath, and then keep going. And it felt better exhaling down.
Mm-hmm.
I never really thought about it. I always thought, you know, you inhale one way and you exhale the other way, but just slowing it down and saying, okay, there's a shift here. I can feel a shift and
Mm.
testing it and then taking a breath and just letting it sink into the ground.
Yeah. Yeah. The exhale is the all-purpose
I
breath
wasn't going to
guide
judge
for a
that.
lot of
I was
people.
just going to say that's how it worked best.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Jessica Char would often say, if you take care of the exhale, the inhale will take care of itself. You know, he was very much in favor of beginning this exploration of breath and movement by emphasizing the action of the exhale for a variety of reasons. And so, yeah, there's no law that says that, you know, you have to divvy up the breath on one side of the movement or the other, you know. And moving on the exhale is quite a valid way to explore that. So yeah, thank you for that. Anything else? I thought I maybe saw. Yeah, let's mute you again. There you go. Said some background noise. Anything else? I'm just going into gallery view here to see. Yeah. Okay. So now let's just say,
Leslie, there's
for
a
the
couple
sake.
of notes.
Oh, okay. So in correlation of the spine video you showed, I noticed that the tailbone, low back, inhale moves towards feet, while the exhale moves tailbone, low back towards head. Yeah. So that would be what you were talking about, the breathing video I showed, right? Yeah. And that's an animation that is not necessarily being contextualized to a specific individual, right? So we can ask ourselves, well, this breathing motion that's being shown here, is this person standing? And if so, how are they standing, right? Are their knees locked? Are their knees bent? You know, so it's a very abstracted thing showing that breath motion is spinal motion, all right? And that these are the possible motions that are going along with the breath. Because the thing about the spinal curves that she's illustrating there, that Jessica's illustrating in that animation, it's the sort of thing that we notice when we're in cat cow, right? I'm just gonna wind up my arms here a little bit. By the way, once you are familiar with this whole thing we were practicing earlier, of finding those spirals in the arms, you don't necessarily need to go through this whole rigmarole to find it. It's like, okay, there it is. You know, it doesn't have to be all of this. So, but when I increase the curve in my thoracic spine, the reciprocal action that tends to happen is a decrease in the curves of the lumbar and the cervical, right? And we call that spinal flexion. When I go the other way, when I decrease my thoracic curve, it tends to increase the lumbar and the cervical. So we would call this action flexion, this action extension. Another way to language it is flexion is an emphasis on the primary curves of the spine. Flexion is an increase in the primary curve of the spine, which is the thoracic, and a decrease in the secondary curves, which is the lumbar and the cervical. Whereas extension is the opposite. Extension is a decrease in the primary curve of the thoracic and an increase in the secondary curves of the lumbar and cervical. And so that's what was being depicted in the animation in this orientation, as the breath motion was increasing the thoracic curve, it was affecting the other curves in a reciprocal way. Now, with specific techniques or intentions, we can change that. For example, and this is this is the next thing that's interesting to explore, because let's say we were doing all of this in preparation for practicing a back bend. And there's like a really cool back bend that you can do from this position. It's called wheel, right? And I'm not suggesting that we're all gonna want to be doing wheel right now, but a variable of how well we can articulate through the spine and ultimately how well we might be able to support a shape like wheel on our arms has a lot to do with the direction of action in our legs. And by that, I mean, when I'm pressing my feet down to raise my pelvis and spine up, am I pressing my feet straight down into the floor, or am I pushing a little bit with my foot, or am I pulling a little bit with my foot? Another way to say that is, am I maintaining samastiti in my feet with an equal downward pressure in all 3 points of those feet? Or am I putting a little more energy into my heel as I press down, which would be a push? Or am I putting a little more energy into the front of my foot, which would be a pull? And so I'll invite you now just to do a few of those ups and downs and put the breath in the background for now. Let the breath do whatever it wants to do, because it may change depending on which way you choose to use your feet and legs. This bit here is the most common thing I find that keeps people from being able to do wheel. It's how they use their legs. The legs are either going to contribute to your ability to get into a pose like that from this position, or if they're not, they can really get in the way. And by the way, you know, you're using the biggest, strongest muscles of your body right now to do this lifting, right? But you don't need to use maximal effort. So when I ask you, for example, to feel what it's like to push into the heels or to pull into the fronts of your feet, okay, don't do it so hard that you cramp up your muscles or in your hamstring. Some people get little hamstring cramps when they do this because they're working them too hard, and you don't need to in this exploration, right? So as you're doing that, I'm reading a comment by Jennifer here. I really needed an exhale to articulate the lumbar, thoracic, to articulate lumbar. Thoracic could articulate on either an inhale or an exhale, but preferred articulating on the inhale. Interesting. These are great observations. And so individual, you know. So are you noticing that? I didn't ask you to notice when we did this previously, whether you were having a neutral foot, a pushing foot, or a pulling foot. But are you noticing now that I'm bringing that to your attention that you have a preference, a preferred way of using those leg muscles to get your pelvis up and down? And if so, what is it? I'm kind of curious to know. So if anyone wants to join in there, that's fine. Are you a pusher, a puller, or a neutral foot person? Anyone? Pushing, neutral. Jennifer is neutral foot. Tanya's a pusher. Sorry, pushing, pusher. Definitely pushing from Amanda. Pushing into heel. Yeah. Yeah, very few people, unless they intentionally make themselves do it, find that they're pullers. I find that they're usually in the minority. and this is pretty much the response I generally get when I poll the audience, either neutral or pushing, but very seldom pulling. Yeah. So has everyone weighed in there? Yeah. Okay. If you pull, are you still using the posterior chain? Oh yeah, yeah. It's just, you know, the same muscles are working. The question is, which ones are shortening, which ones are lengthening, right? So using is a kind of a general term. In muscle, if you want to be specific about muscle use, you'd have to break it down as like which muscles are working concentrically, which muscles are working eccentrically, which ones are working isometrically. Okay. Heel pushing. Yeah. Okay.
I'm wondering if any of these folks are lovers of wheel. Do any of you love doing wheel and just pop right up into it?
Can I, well, can I make a guess here? You know, if I could be permitted a little detective work. If you tend to be, so Amanda's saying, I'm afraid of it. Hate wheel. Jennifer, yes, before my shoulder injury. So Stacy and Amanda, not wheel people. And Stacy said her foot was mostly neutral. Amanda said definitely pushing. Okay. And Amanda also said, I'm afraid of wheel. Right. So see, here's the thing. The more strongly you tend to push into your feet as you raise your pelvis off the floor, the harder your wheel is going to be. Think about it. Let me show you. Let me show you what I mean. And I'm going to add, that only cueing that lift into wheel on an inhale may also be part of the problem. Because as we saw, the thoracic spine likes to go the other direction on an inhale, the direction that's not wheel, right? So let's just say, for the sake of argument, I was interested in doing wheel, right? I'm not going to do wheel, but I'm going to put my hands in the position they would have to be in for me to do wheel. Okay. So which action of my leg is going to make my arms have to work harder to raise the top part of my spine off the floor? A neutral foot, a pushing foot, or a pulling foot, right? So a neutral foot, well, it's kind of neutral. But a pushing foot, can you see? I want to exaggerate. When I use a pushing foot, look what happens to my upper spine and the thrust of my leg muscles, the biggest, strongest muscles of my body. Look at the direction that they're loading into my hands. If I'm pushing with my foot, not only must my arms overcome the weight of this whole part of my body to get it off the floor, they have to overcome the action of the biggest, strongest muscles of my body. One of the main obstacles to people doing wheel is they say, my arms feel weak, my shoulders feel tight. I can't get that last bit to happen. And it's usually not that. They feel that way because, not because your arms are so weak, but because no one's arms are stronger than their legs. That's just how bodies are. And if you're using those leg muscles in a strong pushing action, combining it with an inhale, which makes your thoracic spine want to go the other way, into flexion instead of extension, you've already got two strikes against you, right? Another issue, I think, that I've noticed is that not everyone can actually get their hands in this position. Maybe they do have tight shoulders, or just their arms are shaped in such a way, or their shoulders are shaped in such a way that, you know, that you know, they can't get the whole hand on the ground, maybe just the fingertips, and the heels of the hands aren't going down. And like for me, actually, I have to really pay attention to getting my whole hand on the floor. All right. And so this is often where you'll start getting a suggestion to use blocks or straps or something like that. Now, this is important because it's a base of support for that shape once we get into wheel. But I think it's also important to recognize that this is not the position that your spine and your shoulder blades are going to be in when the hands have to really ground into the floor to lift you into wheel. It's here. This is the position of the shoulder blades and the arms and hands at the moment that they're going to have to do that. And of course, what's happened is as my spine comes up, it also lifts up my shoulder blades, and that actually rotates my arms and hands more into the position that they need to be in for wheel. So I think we need to have a little more confidence in the arms and hands' ability to support that weight by recognizing that it's actually here that they're doing the work, not here, right? We get all fussy with this positioning by analyzing it from this position. And I think people are maybe being over-propped because of that, right? So if I combine an exhale with a leg pull, you know, my legs can then be actually helping to pull the weight off of my hands instead of thrusting weight into them. And so, see, I'm pulling with my legs. And as I'm exhaling, coming up, meaning my thoracic spine is releasing, you know, more into extension, my legs can pull me into the position. See, I said I wasn't going to do wheel, and I went ahead and did it. Well, anyway, there you have it. But that was my legs. My legs did that. My arms had very little to do. They just kind of followed through on the action of these big, strong muscles in my lower body. So if you're willing to, what's that? Sorry?
I'm just asking if that makes sense to everyone, because there's a lot of puzzled looks.
Okay, yeah, I see puzzled looks. I'm just breaking down the components of a pose like that from the standpoint of breath mechanics and from the standpoint of, you know, how are you using your legs to create that motion, and what position are your arms going to be in at the moment they need to do their job. Denise is saying, used to be my favorite pose, but haven't been able to do it for about 20 years. What happened? Other than, you know, just getting 20 years older.
Well, more than that, Denise, do you still want to do it?
Yeah, right. Yeah, where are you? Oh, there you are, Denise. Okay. Are you typing? Looks like you're typing. Okay.
Looks like she's typing, not.
Yeah. Okay. Yes.
I keep forgetting I can talk.
Oh, okay.
I literally took a goal at the beginning of this year that I wanted to get into wheels. So I went to a gym because I became a silver sneakers person. And I told the trainer that what I really want to do is get into a wheel. So I spent all this time lifting weights, everything. I have that belly girth, and I always thought it was the belly that started to accumulate about 20 years ago that was in the way of getting up. Because I have pretty strong legs.
Well, yeah, and your arms will never be stronger than your legs. And so the real question is, are you without really noticing it, knowing that you're doing it, inadvertently using your legs in such a way so as to make it virtually impossible for your arms to do that? And a lot of people have that, you know, it's like, oh, I want to do wheels, so I'm going to strengthen my arms. And, you know, it's not bad to have strong arms, but sometimes they're just making the shoulders tighter, which actually can make wheel even more difficult. But I think I said it up front. One of the main obstacles I found for people being able to do wheel is the fact that they're just pushing. They're pushing with their legs, and and that's when you get into this sort of questionable methodology of stopping halfway with the weight on your head, reorganizing yourself, and then pressing up from there. And that, in fact, is the way it's written down in Light on Yoga. I don't know if you've checked out the entry in Light on Yoga on wheel lately, but that has been enshrined as a method of getting into wheel in Light on Yoga, where you pause with the weight on your head when you're halfway up and then lift up from there. And I find that to be kind of a questionable safety thing from the standpoint of the neck, really. And it doesn't really address some of the things that working on a pose like this has to offer. See, whether you ever actually get into wheel or not is like not all that interesting to me, but understanding some habitual ways we have of using our body, of using our breath, that may be an obstacle to a pose like wheel. See, to me, that's a very interesting conversation. So using wheel as sort of a target for an inquiry to understand ourselves better, I think is very useful. And some of the more challenging poses are like that. It's really not about whether you ever actually do a headstand or not, for example, but breaking it down and analyzing the skills that one would need in order to be able to do a headstand. That's a very interesting conversation, So anything else? Because I think I'd like to just take one of our little breaks here before we go into the final home stretch, literally. Yoga pun. You're welcome, Denise. And Amanda is saying that's a very helpful distinction, Tanya. I think I was doing bridge where I always push into my heels. Okay. Oh, and Tanya said, she responded to something Tanya said. I tried now and realized that I pull when I do wheel and push for bridge. Oh, interesting. Cool. Okay. And so Tanya, is wheel part of your practice?
Well, I don't do it as a regular practice because I think that I'm too old already for these extremes. But sometimes it's just still interesting to see what I can do with my spine, but it requires a warm up. So I cannot come in the morning and start doing wheel. So if I feel that I'm up to try my flexibility, this wave of going up, it's really a pleasure actually to do it. I never thought how I'm doing it. And you're right, it's kind of habitual thing that, okay, I know how to do it, but I don't know how I'm doing. Now I'm realizing that it's really amazing to understand myself better.
Cool.
And watching the breath, because definitely breath lifts me up.
Interesting.
This is a totally sincere question. I really don't know what the answer is, but because Tanya already said that she had been warned against doing flexion movements because of her osteoarthritis. Osteoporosis, rather. What about this kind of extension movement?
Yeah. Should we be concerned about
No. Do people recommend away from things like backbends? I really don't know the answer to this.
It's flexion that's generally considered because of the wedging of the vertebral bodies that happens associated with the anterior border of the vertebral bodies are at risk for collapse in flexion movements for people with extreme osteoporosis. The backbending is not so much a concern, although if you think about it, what's at risk in a backbend for someone with fragile bones are the spinous processes, okay? which is the structures at the back,
Which-
you know, the sticky outy things at the back of the spine, and they're
which are
gonna
super
press into each
fragile
other.
on comparatively way more fragile. You know,
For
they're
some
thin.
people, yes. Yeah, yeah. So, you know, to use the same logic that coaches people away from flexion when they have osteoporosis, you would say also, well, you shouldn't bend backward either. In fact, don't move your spine at all. It's safer. And that's, you know,
Couch potato.
I just don't see
Be a
how that's
couch
a,
potato.
yeah, well, and you know, so don't put any stress on your spine because it could break. Basically, that's the thing. Don't put any stress on your spine because it could break. And, you know, how is it to go through life living with that fear of your spine? I just don't see how that's a constructive mindset to put people in.
How
So,
can you digest your food, let alone your calcium supplements? If you're
well,
fearful.
if you're in that state of fear, if you're in that state of fear of your spine, it tends to leave you in this state of chronic sympathetic activation, right? Which is associated with poor digestion, because your body's metabolic resources are being pulled away from the rest, relax, digest, you know, phase of the parasympathetic arousal into the sympathetic arousal. And I know people who actually have had that problem when they have been trying to faithfully follow this advice to, you know, because you're constantly pulling yourself kind of into a backbend to avoid flexion. And that kind of activates your adrenals, it sends your sympathetic nervous system into overdrive, and it shuts down your digestion, which means that you're not absorbing the calcium in your food or your supplements or your medication. And that's not a good thing. Plus, you're not allowing for some healthy weight bearing in the bones, which is what draws the calcium, the osteoblasts in as well, which those are the cells that build bone strength, the osteoblasts, and the calcium is the raw material for that. So yeah. Anyway, let's take a little break. Come
I
back.
think
Yeah, sorry, Tanya. One last thing before the break.
To do.
Yeah.
With this osteoporosis in mind, in my practice, the only mantra always I have that my spine should be elongated, prevent vertebrae to collapse one into another. And it requires my muscles be strong and supportive. So any flexion or extension, it's first kind of elongating.
Make space first and then move.
Yes, make space between them. And then I tell myself I will be safer, I think. I hope.
Yeah. Well, we can certainly pick up on that after a break. I just want to make sure we get time for that before we come back in the home stretch. So just about 5 minutes here. Feel free to use the facilities. I'm going to put the recording on pause, and we'll join back up then. Okay. See you in a bit. Okay, I'm resuming the recording here. Welcome back, most of you. Oh, there you are. Okay, great. So Lydia very kindly found the images that I had been looking for of our friend Christine Danton. There she is. Okay, so you're all seeing the photos of her in the back bend? Yeah. Lydia, give me a thumbs up if you're seeing it. Okay, great. So yeah, the what she explained is the photo, the black and white photo, all the way on the left side. That's not a performance photo. That was her being photographed for this book on hypermobility. And she was 21 in 1965. And you can see that the back of her head is really, it's pressed up against the backs of her thighs, right? And she's got this, you know, real hinging that's happening at the thoracolumbar junction. And if you draw a straight line through her hip joint down, you know, it falls inside of her feet. That line of gravity falls inside of her feet because the shape she's making is so compact, because she's folding effectively in half backwards, right? That she doesn't have to shift her center of gravity that far forward to maintain her balance, right? But as she, and now here, the rest of them, she's wearing the heels. And as we know, putting something under your heels actually makes it easier to do this, right? here at age 45, you can see that she doesn't have that extreme flexibility anymore. The back of her head, there's a lot of space between the back of her head and her thighs, right? And she's already, you can draw that line through her hip joints down, and it's falling in front of her feet, because the shape her body's making is wider from front to back, and it's not as compact, and she needs to, you know, in other words, the further away her head gets from the backs of her thighs, the further forward her hips have to go, so she doesn't fall over, you know, backwards. And here she is. This is very, very close to what we saw 2 years later in Las Vegas at the, in fact, she's wearing the same outfit at the International Contortion Convention. Here you're seeing she's actually having to start to bend her knees a little bit, right? And how much more of that backward movement she's getting is coming from her hip joints. And here she is. This is right before she had the hip injury, and her knees are quite a bit more bent, and you can see that how far away her head has gotten from the backs of her thighs, when here, you know, 50 years earlier. I mean, look, she's still doing this. She's doing this for over 50 years. That's pretty extraordinary. That's not a fail as far as a contortionist career is concerned. And as Lydia reminded us, you know, she told us she's convinced that it had nothing to do with her performing. Her whole family, you know,
Well,
including
also,
the stiff
Leslie,
people. Yeah.
in terms of you're saying that a little bit of movement from a lot of places, it seems to me that her 2016 position is closer to that ideal of a little bit of movement from a lot of places.
Well, yeah, but she's getting a lot, still getting a lot of movement. She has to get a lot of movement from the fronts of her hip joints to reach her ankles. She's just having to bend her knees now as well. So yes, you could look at it and say, well, she's got a better distributed backward bend at age 71, because the things that were hypermobile on her are less hypermobile. Other things had to start mobilizing. Yeah. So that would be one perspective. This is another one that she's posted on her Facebook of the same trick. So that's pretty close. I mean, clearly she's, you know, at age 36, got a little more range of motion going on, but you know, that's not bad for a 70-year-old. Yeah. So 2011, age 66, that might have been in Vegas. That might have been at the contortion convention. This is the outfit she wore on stage there. It's the one where I showed you the video she was wearing. Okay, so before I launch into the final material here that I have prepared for you, I would be remiss if I didn't sort of poll the audience about any topics at all that you would want to make sure that we at least discussed or covered at this point. So feel free to either say something or type it, because this is, you know,
30 minutes left.
Yeah, I know. So that's why I want to make sure we don't run out of time before we get to something that you feel is really important for you to understand, either for your practice or as a teacher or anything at all. So this would be a good time to say something or not. Yeah, we good? Okay. All right. And if something occurs to you, feel free to just type it into the chat there. So there's other more accessible ways to explore backbending and its relationship to breathing. And I'm trying to, as much as I'm able to, focus on some of the things we find that are kind of unique in the way Deskachar taught all of this. And one of them that comes to mind, actually, so, yeah, I'm still on camera, good, is now this position here, we we like to think of it as like the front half of pigeon, but he actually, there's a distinct name for it. It's called Godha Pitam in Desikachar's sort of cataloging of asana. And the difference is between it and pigeon, of course, is that classically speaking, the front leg of pigeon is very much open, and I'm not even going to try to do that because I would tear my knee to shreds. But this position here, the knee is quite a bit more flexed, and the heel is pulled in so that it's pretty much just under the opposite hip joint, right? And the hand is, the knee is centered between the hands. And the situation this creates, because it elevates the pelvis off the floor, and it allows for some articulation in the lower spine and sacrum. I mean, it's done sort of passively like this as an opening for these deep muscles here under the gluteals, right? So it can be very useful for that. But it's also kind of an interesting platform for spinal articulation. There's not a lot of weight in the hands here, like there would be for up dog. And the movement of the spine is much freer than it is for cobra. And what I'll invite you to do is, if you want to try, so the setup is, as I said, we usually start from the hands and knees position. I'll just do it on the other side. And then the knee comes forward. It's centered between the two hands, and the heel of the front leg, it's lined up pretty much under the opposite hip joint. Okay. And I usually spend a few breaths just sort of settling into the position. And on its own, just this on its own, as I mentioned, can be used very effectively for finding and perhaps releasing some of the tension that we tend to hold in those lateral rotators.
Les, I'm going to interrupt for a moment just to say that if anyone is having difficulty reaching the floor with their head, I encourage you to get something like a pillow or a bolster to give yourself a way of actually releasing into the position.
Yeah. So I was about to say the most famous muscle of the deep six, we call them, is the piriformis. It's often blamed for all sorts of symptoms we tend to have in what feels like the sciatic nerve, and it may or may not be that in many cases, but if people want to do a piriformis stretch, they usually find something like this to do. So after having settled into this a bit, having my hands placed pretty much under my shoulders, I can get this very sort of long feeling in my spine. And as I curl forward here into this flexion, I can actually feel that I can just about bring my forehead towards my front knee, which helps me to complete the flexion in my upper spine and neck. And then the extension as I come up in the other direction feels like I can create it all the way from the crown of my head to my tail. And what I find interesting is playing with the breathing here and see if you agree, because there's certainly something to be said for the exhaling as I'm curling into flexion, and then inhaling as I extend up into that back bending motion, because that's the most obvious dynamic of what's going on in the breath in the front of the body. But what about the opposite? What about inhaling into that flexion and then exhaling into extension. Now, one thing I should say about the breathing here is that I would never cue the breathing with the additional idea that you should be able to breathe as deeply as you possibly can as you're doing this. It's not about really how deeply you can breathe. How much air can you move? How much shape change can you generate? Not really about any of that. It's more about, in some cases, what's the minimum breath you can get away with in an exploration like this? How do you, so is the question, how do you spell the name of the pose? Godhapitam, if that's what the question was. Yeah. So what are you noticing about this? First of all, is this position, movement familiar or unfamiliar to you? Lydia has by the way, Lydia has an interesting alternative version of this, which doesn't require you to be on the floor. So she can show us that in a minute. Just hang on, honey. I just want to see how people are doing with this version, if it is working for them or not, or what they're noticing. It's a long spine feeling we're going for, right? Because you have access to the movements all the way from the crown of the head to the tail, potentially, much more so than in Cobra. Okay, so I'm just kind of watching some of you play with it. Okay, so anything, so Leslie is saying I'd be interested in the non-floor version. Well, it may be time to hand the spotlight over to Lydia then. So why don't you?
That would be my version.
Wait, hang on. Let's just see. You're not fully on camera there. You need to.
Okay, I want to start by showing you a little bit of my body, okay? I'm not bragging, but there's a lot of me, okay? So I got plenty in the front here, plenty up here, and I have one non-biological hip. So, right, that's what I'm dealing with. Anytime I try to do something asymmetric, dealing with my hips, there are so many compromises that I don't usually feel like I'm getting the benefit of the pose. What I have learned to do by way of this is great when I'm sitting in a rolling office chair, but I can do it even in a regular chair or in a big exercise ball. My hands are on the desk. Let's see, my hands are on the desk. And I do all the same movements.
Mm-hmm. And the chair is rolling in coordination with what you're doing.
With a ball, it's great too. But
sure.
This is something that I was introduced to in gyrokinesis and gyrotonics, and then realized I could use in place of this yoga asana, which really just doesn't work for me. So do you want me to show you that one more time, Leslie, or do you feel like,
sure.
Okay,
yeah,
one more time.
Because we can't really see them. I'm assuming your legs are placed symmetrically here. You're not offsetting them like
no,
they
I'm
would
totally symmetric. So here are
Yeah,
my
yeah.
legs, right?
Okay, yeah, there we go.
Here I am. So I'm initiating low.
And then you're articulating from the top down.
No pressure on my hands.
Right, you're not pushing yourself away from the surface with your arms. They're just there to take up the slack.
And the one thing I want to caution some of you who have very flexible necks, I saw you really crank back with your neck. I'm more interested in my neck going up, remembering what it feels like when there's that space in the back of my neck.
Yeah. And you know, sometimes that has to do with kind of a visual orientation of where we're going, like we want to see up and back, or we want to see forward. And if you could you just do that again, honey? And just sometimes you can kind of flip the conversation if you're kind of visually oriented. Is like, what would it be like if you could imagine that you had an eyeball in your sternum, and if your sternum wanted to be able to see up and behind you, and you let that sort of initiate and support that movement. That sometimes that helps for people to keep their head and neck under control, so you're not just whipping it around at the end of your spine in extreme ranges of motion. And the same is true in the other direction. What if the sternum wanted to look back, like towards your navel or behind you or something, right? Yeah. Now,
But this is all being initiated with breath.
Yeah, yeah. So I was just going to ask you about the breath. So what sort of breathing pattern seems to work best for you in that variation?
I actually can get an equal amount of lengthening and release with the first 2 times I did it in the traditional breathing. That is, I was exhaling into extension and then into flexion.
Flexion,
yeah, inhaling into extension. And then the last time I did it opposite. It really doesn't matter. What I hear is different stuff, like little crackles in my back. I get different sounds depending on whether I'm breathing in or out in one position or the other.
It makes different music from your body.
You know, this is the hand Leslie was talking about where I broke like 8 bones, and that's what it does. So you can imagine me trying to do any like upper body weight belt. It's ridiculous. Forget it. You know, I could go like over a ball, but I can't go on the floor. So no upper body weight bearing. And then I'm the one whose elbows don't straighten, right? You know, this is me. Elbows don't straighten. That's how I am.
Yeah, and they're kind of pointed. They're pointed in a strange direction too. Yeah.
And my sister apparently is the same way, and she's super, super mobile, where I'm super dense. But we both have arms that were put on the wrong way. It's like little baby, you know, doll arms, and they didn't turn them all the way. Like ours got stuck on in the wrong direction. So,
okay.
Go figure.
All right. So there's some comments here. So Judy is saying, in the Gota Pitham position, had a hard time reversing the breath. Ran out of breath capacity before I reached the full extension or flexion motion. With the traditional breathing pattern, movement felt really good. Yeah, right. So what, and Denise is thanking you for the demo, Lydia, very helpful. So my question there for Judy, and I suspect that you're not alone in feeling that. Sorry, you're I'm gonna cancel your spotlight, so okay. All right, here we are. So what if it wasn't about taking a full breath, right? Because you used the word capacity, like we all have developed in our practice, I would say, sensory motor neuromuscular memory patterns that we associate with a complete, full, satisfying breath. And when we're doing something that frustrates that, and we're not reaching that, okay, it can feel like, well, not great. It doesn't mean we don't have enough oxygen. And that's the point I wanted to make. There's a difference between getting adequate oxygenation for an activity in which we are engaged and reaching that sort of moment where we feel like we have a complete breath. That's different. That is the sensory motor memory we associate with a particular kind of a shape change in our cavities. But it's not the same thing as having adequate oxygenation. And I often find myself having to point this out to people with breathing disorders, with panic disorder, asthma, things like that. You know, because getting enough oxygen is what's really important about breathing, and having adequate oxygenation for whatever your body's metabolic needs are in the moment. So to concretize that with this exercise, because I found that this is an excellent opportunity to make this point. Okay. Yes, I can, when this is an inhale and this is an exhale, I can get to that point where it's like, yes, that feels like a full inhale. And yes, it feels like I'm emptying. Okay. But when I reverse that and I inhale on the way down and exhale on the way up, I can get plenty of oxygen. I'm not running out of oxygen here. I can just feel the backs of my lungs opening just enough and closing just enough. So sometimes we have to flip the conversation from how much can I do to how little can I get away with. Another thing to point out is that, as I said before, you don't necessarily have to link each movement to a breath. I can exhale down, take a breath once I'm here, which is an interesting position to inhale into, and then exhale up and take a breath here. Right? So if you're willing to experiment just a little bit with some of those ideas, and you're welcome to do Lydia's variation. You don't have to be in the full-on Gotapitam. Give that a try and see. Just flip the conversation, the breathing conversation, from how much can I get to how little can I get away with, and see if something makes sense for you. Okay. Just going to put you back in gallery view here. Keep in mind, the question of adequate oxygenation is directly related to how much muscle energy am I expending in this activity. The more muscular it is, the more oxygen your body needs. So it's also very much related to the efficiency with which we are moving. The more muscles are firing in this movement, the more oxygen they'll need in order to do that. From a certain perspective, asana practice, vinyasa, the stuff we do with our bodies as part of yoga, can be contextualized in a breath-centered approach to finding good space for breathing, and then challenging our ability to keep finding that good space sort of systematically with the different shapes we make, the different movements we do, the different techniques. So finding the good space is one thing. Being able to keep finding it by adjusting not just what we're doing, but how we're doing what we're doing is sort of the ongoing inquiry from a certain perspective. Can I find it in a twisting movement? Can I find it in a forward bending movement? Can I find it in a backward bending movement? Where is the space? Because it's all about sukha and dukkha from that perspective. And Deskachar was very, very much coming from that place, that yes, we can say all these things about yoga practice, classical yoga practice, Patanjali's yoga, about enlightenment and Kaivalya, and all of the sort of more esoteric goals of yoga. And it's not like he wasn't willing or able to talk very authoritatively about all of that. But in the very real life practical terms and situations that we're all confronted with in our lives, he was just mostly concerned about relieving suffering, reducing dukkha. The reduction of dukkha is what we're really focusing on. And dukkha, the word dukkha in Sanskrit, breaks down as dus and ka. Ka is space. Ka means space, and dus is bad space. So all forms of suffering, from his perspective, can be reduced to this idea. There's some space that we should be feeling, having, experiencing, breathing in, some freedom of prana to move in the system through that space. And when that's obstructed in some way by a physical pattern, a habit, a way of thinking that's not completely aligned with reality or our best values, these obstructions can happen on any level. Dukkha arises on any level, but it's always an obstruction of space. And then when we find ways to identify and release that obstruction, we move from dukkha to sukha. And sukha just means good space. It also means the good axle hole. That's a translation of sukha. It's the good axle hole, not just any axle hole, but the good axle hole. Well, what could be a bad axle hole? Well, if it's not exactly in the center of the wheel, it's not a great axle hole, because you can imagine what it would be like to ride in a cart that has wheels that are spinning on an axle, but the hole is off center, right? So this centered space as a definition of sukha is a very powerful way of thinking of what the goal of a yoga practice is. Because people are like wheels, according to this teaching. Without a space at the center, we're pretty useless. It's as useless as a wheel without an axle hole or an off-center axle hole. So hopefully that offers a little bit of perspective on, there's certainly a technical side, an anatomical side to what we're doing, and that's sort of my contribution, I feel, to Desikachar's heritage. If the techniques that he taught are very clearly intended to allow us to articulate our spine in the same direction, in the same movements as the flow of prana into and apana out of the system, then being able to express that idea in more detailed anatomical terms is something I've sort of taken on for myself, because that wasn't the way he talked about it. It was clearly there, though. So this is, what I hopefully was able to communicate about the inspiration that I've drawn from my teacher and his methods, and expressing it through this particular lens of my area of interest, which is anatomy and breathing and all of that. And so, Kathy is saying Shana Tova. Yes, tomorrow is Yom Kippur. Happy Jewish New Year. Wishing for a loving, peaceful year for all. Follow the heart and breath and vote. Peace. Yes. Well, and right on. Yes. So any final thoughts before we wrap it up? We got like 5 minutes before we sign off. Anything you notice in that last version where I gave you permission to not breathe deeply, but just breathe enough. See if it's enough. Did that change your experience? I saw, Tanya, you were really going at it there for a while, so I'm kind of curious what you were doing with that. Yeah. And then I see you, Marilyn, also. Yeah.
That on reverse pattern, when we do inhale down, and they just do inhale and see where I move. It's more movement in my thoracic spine. Both times, my lift and going down, it's my thoracic spine working with inhale down, exhale up. Worse to more open, more exaggerated pose. Inhale, it's lumbar spine, and exhale the same. It's actually
right. So
just
the reversal made it
for me.
more. The reversal made it more thoracically oriented for you, is what I'm hearing, and I
Yeah,
hear that a
yeah.
lot actually. And a lot of people are quite surprised to find out how locked up all this stuff is, you know, or even to recognize that, wow, you mean that can move? I'm allowed to move it, or, you know, all of that. So yeah, that's a great perspective to have. And just by adjusting these, you know, breath and movement things, it shakes loose a whole lot of body information, we should say. So Marilyn, you had raised your hand there, so I want to make sure we have time to get to you. Thank you. There you go.
I just wanted to add that going back to something that you said at the beginning of our time together about how we look at practices individually. And so everything that you've said has actually taken me to a place where I can, in my own practice, say, just because I don't have a lot of breath here doesn't mean I'm slacking off. Right? It's just that I'm experiencing something different, and it's okay either way. And so I have actually loved being able to reverse and switch around. I love it, and thank you.
Cool.
Thank you.
Oh, I can't tell you how happy that kind of comment makes us feel. I know Lydia's overjoyed. I can see that on her face.
No,
course, you can
absolutely,
always-
Marilyn. That's just what we are hoping for. You know, this is, as Leslie said at the beginning, breath-centered, individualized yoga, and that's what this is all about. So it's hard to do that over Zoom, but I'm really glad that you were able to take that away. So yeah.
And we're learning all the time better ways to communicate this wherever we're teaching, whether it's live or now, you know, Zoom wise. So I really, really thank you guys for hanging in there and being willing to experiment with this thing, to maybe wade through some of the uh-ohs. And I hope there were at least a few ahas waiting for you at the end of the sea of uh-ohs, perhaps. And so just thank you so much for this opportunity. And of course, to you folks down in the Sun Moon territory, and Vicky, thank you. And, you know, Amir and Annie. And big
Vicky,
thanks
I
always
hope
to
that knee gets better really quickly and you can go back to your life. But take Advil tonight. So
right. Yeah, we had this discussion, you know, sometimes just got to hit the Advil. So thank you all so much. I will get to work right away as soon as we sign off in a minute. The videos have to download, then I have to upload them to YouTube, and then we'll put the links on that web page. And feel free to review any of it at any point. And just really happy to see you all. And yeah. And oh, look who came on right before the end. Hey, how you doing? Okay. That's
nice
great.
to see your face, Kathy. We wondered about you.
I so love that you can just turn your camera off and participate that way. It is just, you know, there's so much adaptability to this way of teaching that whatever the drawbacks are,
I can watch and listen better that way.
Exactly, without worrying that, you know, that you're being seen. And that's great. You know, this is the level of agency that I hope to bring to a live room, you know.
Well, for what it's worth, Leslie,
yeah,
with my internet being funky today, when I was having trouble hearing you and I was losing chunks of sentences, if I turned my video off, I got better audio. So I do think it has some, like, if the Wi-Fi is not great, that is actually an important thing to consider still.
It's a bandwidth adjustment, absolutely. Yeah. So thank you all so much. Feel free to stay in touch. You can use that feedback form. You can email us. We do love to hear from you any way you choose to reach out. And you take care, stay safe, and hopefully we'll see you in person back when the world, you know, when the world gets back to being a little less sideways. So Take care, everyone. So good to see you and spend this time. Bye now.